Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Chris Ryan. I work over at The Ringer. And it's my honor to present to you this panel of people who worked tirelessly to bring us one of the best shows that I've seen in recent memory. It's Station 11. So let me first start with Patrick Somerville, the creator, showrunner, executive producer. Ruth Ammon, who is the production designer. Jeanie Bacharach, who's the casting director. Liza Richardson, who's the music supervisor. Helen Huang, who's the costume designer. And then Steve Cosens, who's the cinematographer. And David Eisenberg, who is the editor. So these are the people who made Station 11. Give them a round of applause. This is a thrill because I've talked to you, Patrick, a bunch of times about the show. We've had Patrick on the watch to discuss the themes and the ideas and our emotional reaction, our intellectual reaction to the show, but it's really rare that I get a chance to have so many wonderful people to talk to at once about the making of the show and what goes into it.
Yeah. I mean, I was watching these guys come up. It was incredible because you never get to have this kind of conversation, and maybe it's not obvious to people at home when they watch TV shows, but the show and this scene is a perfect example. It just wouldn't exist without all these imaginations and a bunch more who aren't here. And so it's more a mesh of and collaboration of a lot of different people's points of views than one showrunner or writers or directors. And we wanted to show this this piece of episode 10 that you guys just saw, just because it was so special that night walking out onto set. It was overwhelming, because it was the density of work that was visible everywhere you looked, from the wagons to the costumes, to the music that was playing that we could hear, and the shot select. It was a culmination, I think, of many years of work of many different departments simultaneously, and that's really rare that it all comes together in one place in time. And so there isn't a pixel that isn't someone's years of thinking in the background of any of those shots.
Now, I think a lot of people who are familiar with this show are familiar with the story of the making of the show, which is intertwined with what the show is actually about itself, with the pandemic and everything. It was a very, I think, a labor of love is fair to say for everybody here, and one that was a really extensive marathon production. So, Ruth, I was wondering if we could start with you, because I would imagine you start getting involved at the script level? I mean, when somebody comes on as a production designer, does it usually start with concepts, or are you reading story, or are you reading script?
I think when I came on, there was a pilot script, and I started meeting with Hero and Patrick first, and I was in another country working on something else, and I listened to the book Station 11 as I was driving around Budapest, and it just had such a meaningful story to me, and also knowing Patrick's work, I really wanted to be part of anything he was doing. So I put a pitch book together and met with Hero and Patrick and showed some of the ideas that I had, and then Hero sent me his book, and clearly we were on the same path to what we wanted to do. And you don't know
Ruth and Hero had the same photos in their decks that they both made independent of each other.
What, as reference points?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So when you go to a meeting, when you read a script and you're going to have a meeting with a showrunner or director, you try to pitch your ideas. You read a script and somehow it moves you, and images start coming together, and you kind of gather collective ideas of what you imagine the world could be. And they're just somebody else's photos, but they have some kind of resonance to you. And it's a way for when you meet with the showrunner that you can share ideas and see where you think the story may go.
Now, Jeanie, one of the things I love so much about this show is that the people in it both look like people that you see on the street and people that you see in your real life, and don't look like people you usually see on television. I thought you had such a great eye for that. What kind of conversations did you have with Patrick, with Hero, with people about how to populate these actually multiple worlds when you think about it?
I mean, I think what was important was that it reflect the world. And those were some of the early conversations we had. And there was the world before and the world after. And that for the character of Alex, that, you know, as a post-pandemic, you know, we wanted to reflect sort of a non-traditional way of looking and feeling, and you know that in the post-pan world, people weren't going to be kind of sticking to the same sort of norms and ideas of sexuality, of gender. So she certainly was somebody that, you know, we talked a lot about how that was going to be important, but really about reflecting the world.
You know, I kind of want to open this up, and everybody feel free to jump in, but you touched on something there, which is Patrick kind of communicating certain themes from the script, certain ideas from the script, and how it translates into the hands-on work that you're doing in your departments. What were those collaborations like? I mean, does anybody remember any early conversations with Patrick about, this is what this show is about, you know, and this is how it's going to be reflected in the work you're doing?
I mean, Pat likes to talk a lot. You know, sometimes that's annoying, but actually at the end of the day, it's a great thing because he's open. You know, he gives us all the flexibility to kind of do our job.
When specifically was it annoying?
We can cancel the questions from the audience if you want to just rattle them off, yeah?
No, so it does start early, and I'm sure everyone on the panel can attest that, you know, he wanted to talk about all this stuff. He wanted to talk about all the themes so that we had a good understanding, and then we could take it into each of our departments and do the things that we want to do.
Helen, will you tell the story of Dr. Levin's costume? Because I feel like that was maybe the first big conceptual breakthrough that we kind of came to together, all of us in Chicago, and it really meant a lot for the show.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Patrick is like the best showrunner in a way where he gives like very emotional, you know, written like from an author point of view notes. He's not gonna be the type of person that looks at a picture or a reference and be like, I don't like that button. That's like my worst nightmare. So he's the best at that. And with Dr. Levin, it was hard because it was like supposed to be a person from a comic book, but we didn't have the comic book yet. But we were shooting it before there was an artist for it. And so, you know, we had a lot of conversation about like who this astronaut is.
And we were really struggling to find the language to describe the feeling that we were looking for. And I think there was like the plane of masculinity. We didn't want it to be a heroic figure, but we didn't want to be a joke. And we were stuck. Like I couldn't find a way to say it.
But I think eventually the words came out, like we want Dr. Levin to feel like a janitor, like a really worn out space janitor. And
that was one thing. I think that helped us, one rung of the ladder.
Yeah, that did really help. But also, like, I was like a person possessed. Like, I literally looked at every space movie ever made. I looked at every astronaut suit ever made. You know, Ruth had a huge book of astronaut suits that I studied. But then it was about like trying to make it something familiar. And also Patrick was very specific about like the face of Dr. Levin. He wants the face to feel very human, but it's like, how do you make a costume like that when you don't see a face look very human and sympathetic and mysterious at the same time? And so we actually made Dr. Levin's head way bigger than any astronaut suit ever. And we came with these like teal color that they had to dye everything to match. That was reflective of an old interior suit from the 1960s. Yeah, there was just so many sort of like, and we purposely like made all his parts rusty, his backpack rusty. So it was kind of this blend between, and also like, this sort of blend between like realistic things and almost like a cartoony illustration aspect to him. But I showed Patrick like literally like little tiny drawings to like full out like renderings by our illustrator. And I had a book where it was just like astronaut after astronaut after. I don't know how he could stand me, but it was like I was like, we're gonna get this right.
The artist, it was the artist who, it was when we said imaginary friends.
Yeah.
That you had that last idea, right?
Yeah.
And I don't remember that artist's name that you brought in to show us his work, where he had exploded kids' drawings into paintings.
I forgot who it was, but I remember I brought up Chagall as someone that I really wanted to mimic, because like Chagall, you know, is an artist that built these like fantastical costumes that like look like they were an illustration, but like existed in the real world, and that was something that's very important to me. Actually, when we went to build it, the place that built it, Global Effects, they were like, this is not an astronaut suit. Like, I don't even know what you're handing me, like, to build. And I was just like, it's more of a mascot than a functioning, it's like the mascot of the show, you know?
This sounds very kind of organized. We're in a line and we have microphones, but really these conversations in Chicago and then later were happening with like a bunch of people manically around a table, a big thing down, and people are pointing. So the crew was really special. I think like we generated ideas together, which doesn't always happen.
If I can go back to my casting question for a minute, because it's really about me.
Yes. Back to you, Jeanie.
But you always think of all those things like after, you're like, oh, I just wish I said. No, but I will say just in terms of the casting too, I think in some of what you're touching on, all of you, is both an authenticity and an accessibility. That it was so important to go on the journey with these people, so that accessibility was going to be, you know, and connecting to those characters and finding a way in for our audience.
You know, I wanted to talk a little bit about how you all collaborated with one another. You know, I think for in layman terms, you know, like you look at it and you think, well, that department has an office and then this department has an office, and maybe you see each other at the water cooler like at a normal job, but I'm sure that there's more interaction. But Liza and Steve, I imagine you have very specific experiences, because Liza, you're working with one of the best scores I've heard on a TV show in recent memory, and also a combination of like diegetic and needle drop music. And then Steve, you're working with other directors of photography, several different directors. What were your interdepartmental collaborations, I guess, like you're, you know, in the music and in terms of cinematography?
Go ahead.
Well, I think for me, it all starts with really a great book and great scripts. And you know, the first 2 episodes that were shot in Chicago by Christian Sprenger and that Hero directed, they were very minimal. They had a kind of elegant simplicity to them. And as soon as I saw those, I knew that they were speaking a language that I could carry on through the rest of the episodes. And when I met with Patrick and with Ruth, it became clear that we all kind of, without even really, I often feel like we didn't even speak that much about things, that there was often this kind of intuitive...
Oh, really?
I felt like there was kind of an intuitive connection often. Like with Ruth, often we would go to a location and Ruth and I would often look in the same direction and say, okay, well, this is it right here. This is where we have to look. And
annoy Jeremy.
and annoy Jeremy.
That is true. I think there were so Ruth and Steve were uniquely charged with having to build what year 20 looked like, but in different ways. What the world felt like, I think Steve visually and Ruth, and I would say even deeper conceptual level. And Helen, I mean, everyone was doing that. We didn't know what year 20 was, but I think Steve joined us when we went to Canada. Okay. And so the big task, I think, when we got there was, what the fuck does year 20 look like? And because we really didn't have much idea at all yet. And so, yeah, these two were scouting all over the place over and over again.
Yeah, I think Patrick was clear that year 20 we wanted to embrace nature, and nature, you know, didn't want to be threatening, and, you know, just because we were most of the year 20 stuff we shot in Toronto in the summer, it had its own aesthetic of being lush and you know, quite beautiful. So that automatically kind of gave it a different tone, I would say.
We had the extra challenge that it was the dead of winter as we were scouting as
Yes,
well.
yeah,
So
yeah.
we were guessing.
I mean, I just always want to point out that we had one extraordinary experience that most television series don't ever get, is we had done the pilot in episode 103 in Chicago, and that was when we started reading about COVID in the newspaper as we were going home to have our hiatus. And then the project was on hold, and somehow Patrick and David Nixay, I suppose our producer, gave us time during the summer. It was Helen, myself, Patrick, and Jeremy, who was joining the show. We had a month or two, it was a month, I had a crew on, I had some people doing drawings and doing virtual reality drawings, but it was 4 weeks where we could just imagine anything, because at that point we hadn't thought about what is this traveling symphony going to look like, what is Hamlet going to look like, what is year 20 going to look like. We all knew what we didn't want it to look like, so that 4 weeks we would Zoom, you know, once or twice a week and just throw out whatever you wanted, and there was no pressure for time, money, anything. So it was you know, you never get that in a television series, because from day one you're always like under the fire to, you know, produce documents and get things ready and budget. And so I think that allowed for us to go to Toronto having a lot in our hearts about what the future of the show is going to be.
Ruth made the airport in Unreal Engine. One day we looked at the wagons deployed in a circular space in a 3D rendered environment that didn't exist, and we were like, yes, that's where we're going. And I asked to enter it using an Oculus, but we never quite figured that out. And out of that too came Helen's design for Kirsten's early costume stuff in episode 2, and including the puffer cape. Is that right? Which are two huge conceptual breakthroughs for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think always her costume was going to be like where all the other costumes were going to come from. She was going to set the tone of it. And, you know, I always wanted the costumes to be like, because we're doing Shakespeare, but like I didn't want it to be like traditional European costumes. And I just wanted to, you know, and then you could think about these characters as people who like get together to make these things, but they're not like by any means professional, and it could be anything that they want. And so it's like, how do you show a Gertrude, a queen, without the European references to that? How do you show a king? How do you show Hamlet? Patrick was very much like Hamlet should be black. I always imagined him in black, and so we did do all black outfit, but then it felt a little bit too severe for the world. And so that's why we had like different sort of textures with the puffers and kind of like different paintings all over the garment, which you can't tell all the details from the what you see on screen, but there was an enormous amount of trial and error trying to make it have the right textures and tones, so it doesn't look like, you know, we're staging another King Lear like in the first episode, where it felt very different.
Can I ask, just to go back to something, Ruth, that you were talking about, and I'd be curious to hear everybody chime in here. You know, in that hiatus that you had, and in this sort of longer than usual break, how much do you think the real world wound up impacting the way you were conceiving of the show, the work that you were doing? And do you ever think about the normal version of Station 11 that just goes right into, you know, this next block of shooting, and you just the train keeps on running, and what it would have, how your work might have been different specifically?
Well, I can say for sure, for me, it made all the difference in the world, but yet it felt very seamless. I just remember the first time I came out of my apartment, because I had been away for almost 2 years, and when we broke for the hiatus, all of a sudden we were in lockdown, and it was the first time I went on the road driving and feeling the sense of speed, which I hadn't, you know, we'd all been locked up, and just like, so motion, sound, the birds, nature, it had such a huge impact on me that I knew, and Emily St. John Mandel had actually written about that was just so organic to how we were discussing moving forward to year 20.
Oh yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts about that hiatus?
I think, during the pandemic, I was like, oh, when in times of dire need, people turned back to like craft, because everyone was like making a sourdough bread and like crocheting.
R.I.P. to my sourdough bread, yeah.
But like the fact that like at that moment when the world, you're not so sure about it, you go to do a form of like art, going back to working with your hands. And I thought that was very important in this future, and it informed like a lot of, like with Alex, like we made a lot of her things because, they're like found objects. And so like, what is this world where they find all these objects and sort of cobble together things without rules? But I just thought that was like pretty fascinating that, out of all the things we could be doing with our time, like people were like knitting.
Yeah. Liza, I wanted to go back to my music question there just briefly, because you're responsible, somewhat for how the show feels, somewhat for how the show sounds, somewhat for the taste of the show in certain ways, and you're filling in some emotional colors with the music you're choosing. And you're also choosing things that characters in the show are talking about or playing for one another. Can you talk to me a little bit about the sort of multifaceted nature of this job?
Yeah, so pretty much almost everything that is talked about as a song as a character has already been conceived and scripted by Patrick. So, but I was interested in what you said because we talked a lot in the beginning. Well, first of all, I'm the music supervisor, but we have an amazing composer, Dan Romer,
yeah.
who's not here. Why not?
What up with that?
You can cover the music element.
But he did not only score, but a lot of original songs. And in the beginning conversations about that, similar to what you're talking about, it was just like, the instruments are kind of broken. They've been repaired a lot. They're going to sound a little bit different. And what does that sound like? And what, a ragtag sort of.
And that led to Dan. I asked him to break a cello and play it.
Yeah.
But he wouldn't do that. But he strung
like
it with something like the wrong strings, and he eventually found a sound in the show that we called the demon cello that comes up now and then. It's like a and it really stands in for the virus. But he's running like a cello through all sorts of all outrageous pieces of technology to get there. But that it came from what you're talking about, like rebuilding out of the pieces of a broken thing.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And it's, for me anyway, it's great to be sitting with, so I mostly work in post. I did, I was on in the beginning reading the scripts and helping prepare songs for set, but I never went to set. So it's great to be sitting with you guys because, when people ask me how I do music supervision, I really honestly take my cues from the costume design, the set design, the way it's shot, and the casting, and the level of complexity that I can look at a script and get a few ideas, but I really respond to what I'm seeing. And then the other thing is just that David and I have worked together on Leftovers and Watchmen. I worked with Patrick on Leftovers, and so, David and I feel like have a really good connection musically.
You're two high-taste individuals.
But he just cuts things so well and makes your songs just incredible. So it's, all I can do as a music supervisor is bring, ideas to the table or horse to water, but he makes it like really yummy and tasty water and makes it, I don't know. Anyway.
It's so cool as a viewer to watch the show and think about how, obviously, I'm sure the music industry is one of the first things to go in this year 20 world. There's not SoundCloud then. But this goes for clothing production and architecture and building and stuff, and you start to think about these sort of silos that you're concentrating on and what happens when those things are no longer being built, so you're making a world where there isn't a world almost. I think that must be really fascinating to do. David, were you watching dailies? Were you on set? You and Patrick obviously have a long-standing work relationship, so are you involved from the genesis of the project, or are you coming in mostly at post?
I did start early. I was not on set. I was in my garage. No windows. Classic editor day situation. But it did start early. I was always, because Pat and I are close, and we were planning on doing this together. I was reading the scripts, so starting to wrap my head around it pretty early on, and then, as production begins, the dailies are rolling in, and then it's once that train starts, it doesn't stop. So it's going for a long time.
And the Toronto version for me, 3 hours ahead, was at noon. David would appear on a screen in my trailer, and then we would be working on the episodes together. 7 was the first one we did in Canada, and I was sort of pulled to concept meetings and prep to set, and then we had a very rigorous output schedule for the episodes as well. So he showed up at noon and he left late.
Crazy. That was a crazy part of it, which maybe not many people know. We did episode 1 in Chicago, then the pandemic started. We had a year off. The first episode we did when we came back was 7, then 9, then 5, then 6, 4, and then 2. So we did episode 2 last, or 10 was earlier on.
8 and 10 right.
8 and 10 right there. So it was incredibly out of order, but in a weird way it made a lot of sense for what we were doing, and gave us a glimpse, by doing the finale early, we kind of knew where we were headed, and episode 2 was so great to kind of do last because it was the first glimpse into year 20. So, not planned. It was planned, but it's tough when you have to do it like that, but in a weird way it helped us.
If there was one actor here, they would say it was not straightforward, easy, helpful, or good.
I was wondering, because for the benefit of the audience and actually for my own edification, you made reference to, David's getting up, he's signing on at 12. Could you all sort of walk us through like a garden variety day from like a day, what's like a day look like making Station 11 in Toronto, say? Doesn't matter what episode, but just pick one that maybe you were all working on, and what's like the schedule look like?
Well, it's a little different for all of us. For Steve, for Ruth, these 3, Jeanie, Liza, and David were back home, and so
I was just at home imagining.
Yeah. Everybody's job comes at kind of a different time in the cycle, but my sense of Ruth, as we were in production, was she represented the future to me. She represented everything that's coming in the next 3 weeks. She was scouting, she was building new sets, she was planning what we were going to be doing down the road. Same for Helen and her team. They were always sort of ahead of me, but there's a set presence for costumes. So I was kind of could only think about today, honestly. And so maybe my day I would go over and see some new costumes in Helen's trailer that the actors had just tried on. I think I would hear from Ruth on a scout, on a FaceTime suddenly as I was walking to stages. And then I would get to the stages and see Steve in his jumpsuit, looking very serious, standing beside Jeremy.
We'll get back to the jumpsuit. I want to hear about this.
He only wore a jumpsuit the entire shoot.
I was going to wear it today, but...
You should have. He never changed. It was always blue jumpsuit. And I would go to set, and I would, see what they were shooting, and there would be technicalities, and then I'd go back and work on the cut of an episode with David. But that doesn't tell the story of what these guys were doing in a day. We were also all getting up at like 5 and going to bed at midnight every day. To throw that in there.
Except for David, who's rolling in at noon, just like, hey guys, West Coast living.
Yeah, must be nice.
I don't know, the one thing you mentioned about the order and the sequence of how we were filming, I mean, Helen and I were talking last night about when we watched the show and the series, we were like, what? Did that, like, So we lived on trust and Patrick's constant pitching of how
It's
the
going to
story
make
was-
sense, I
right.
promise.
And so it was really nice just being blind and just trusting in the story was going to come together, because when the show itself is so complex that if you try to figure it all out, like you can only block certain amount of concepts, very broadly at each time. And, frequently you're out roaming the countryside and trying to tell people in a field, oh, that's where the house is going to be and that's where this is going to be, and it's all imagination. But when it all came together, I was surprised. And I wasn't surprised, but I just didn't know the story as well.
You can
as
say that.
I
That's
was-
okay.
No, but I did not know the story to that extent. And I know you were talking about, like, you two had a language of how these pieces were all going to go together.
I think we did. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out, but it was always nerve-wracking, kind of looking at it. But that's where all these people come in and play. Like we were also talking about last night, on a gig like this, it's great because at each step of the way the show got elevated. So by the time it got to me, sometimes in post you're just fixing problems, and this time, it was just how do I elevate it to an even better, outdo what everyone else has done and try to just get it to that next step. And, that's just a testament to everyone up here that how great they did.
Helen, do you remember the day from the clip? And you too. It was very special because something good is happening when the other members of the teams and departments start coming out and taking photos of themselves with the actors in between shoots. But everyone was sort of, and Lisa from makeup and Nani from hair too.
Yeah.
Kind of all the HODs sort of came. It's just like 3 o'clock in the morning also because those were night shoots, and so you start at dusk and
remember
wrap
that.
at dawn.
I
But-
was like sleeping in my car, and then all of a sudden I got like on the walkie. They were like, "Okay, everyone's getting dressed," and you're like rushing to set to get people dressed. It was like pretty amazing because we had been working on these costumes like literally for like months, and like doing trials on body doubles, having the real actors there, me doing like a lot of research and just like having inspo photos to our tailoring room, our aging dying room, who made all those fabulous things. And a big part of my day was like going in and see the fabulous sort of inventions they cook up when I show them a reference of something that I want. And sometimes I would text Patrick like a picture of a rock and be like, I want this for like the costumes. He always gets references that are like never about clothes. And he's like, yeah, go for it. But I think that was one of the biggest things when all the actors came together and put on the stuff. It was like just so amazing. And I do have to say, poor actors, because paper mache, you can't sit down in anything. And so they were doing like a 13-14 hour shoot, and they were like literally, they had a stool where they knelt, like they kneeled.
They were pretty crabby that night, I gotta say.
They couldn't sit. Like Saeed's character had a full he was wearing a bodysuit, and then the outside of the bodysuit was like this skirt we made out of soda cans that was like glued together, and he literally, like, nobody could sit or just be comfortable the whole night, but they sucked it up, and it was just kind of like, it was just so magical to have it all come together, and for Ruth's beautiful production designs, and for, and then they did play the music, and then everyone sort of mimed, and it was like,
Dan had written the Hamlet score ahead of time, so it was
Yeah.
actually playing there that was another unusual element of the show and
Yeah.
the music. Sometimes we needed to be ahead.
Yeah.
We generated our own music a lot too, so Dan and Liza too were prepping, for example, for Naban's rap.
Yeah.
Which was, yeah.
Crowd
He
favorite.
did that the first take perfectly and did it 5 times. If you get an entire group of Canadian crew dancing, that's impressive. We were new to them too. That was like day 5.
You sent me his rehearsal or audition. What
Yes.
was it? And it was perfect too.
Oh yeah, and so in quarantine, we had to quarantine for 2 weeks in the hotel before Naban practiced, and Dan made the beat out of my voice and we sent it to Naban, and he sent me a video back, and he was already perfect there, so he was ready. But yeah, that took some preparation to be ready for the musical moments.
Yeah.
And Liza and Dan both did a lot.
Yeah, some of the musical moments are so stunning in this, and I think that the cool thing about them is there are moments in shows or movies where it's a great song and it's playing, but you can really feel like the ways in which everybody here worked together and everybody here, their work came together, especially in those musical moments of the Smog song we were talking about backstage, or the Bill Callahan song that's
Bill
playing.
Callahan.
That's such a wonderful moment. I wanted to ask before we get to some questions from the audience, not to put people on the spot, but was there a moment in the show when you were watching it, after it had come out, that you watched and you were like, I'm particularly proud of this piece of work? And it could be something of your own, hopefully, but if it was something else, that's fine. But Steve, I thought I'd start with you. Was there
for me, making episode 9, the whole birthing sequence, all the stuff at the abandoned Kmart or Habermakers, while I was shooting it, I had a feeling it was going to be beautiful and moving. And whenever I see that sequence, the whole birthing thing, it always brings me to tears. And I love that whole.
That's a pretty
sequence.
common reaction to that scene, yeah. Helen, what about you? Anything?
I mean, the whole thing was like such a joy. I always so when we shot episode 1, it was like really getting a sense of like the world, but also like these people that I'm collaborating with, and just like making young Kirsten's dress, her little pink dress, and then putting her in that puffer. And I remember we were doing the screen test and I was trying to make it all pretty. And then Patrick came to set and he's like, let's zip her up. And she looked so odd with the little dress under and the little zipper, like the little puffer zipped up. And he was like, that's how we do it in Chicago.
The Chicago way? Yeah.
He's like, it's
I
not
grew up
pretty.
in Wisconsin. Yeah, you got to zip that up.
Yeah. And so it's just like, and I knew like, from that moment, like I really found a creative home, because it's not every day where you get to make something equally beautiful, but also equally with people that have a sense of humor about the world and about all the nuances of what it's like to be human. And like, that's not something, a lot of times, when you're working, they ask you to take that away because they want everything to look perfect. But this was very much about like, let's explore, like just the quirks and of people and the weirdness in people, and like it was just so special.
Anyone else have a moment that they're particularly proud of? Jeanie, was there anybody that when you saw them on screen, you were like, yes, got that one?
Well, it's casting is so strange because you're there at the beginning, and then if it shoots out of town, and especially with COVID, I didn't get to go to Toronto or Chicago, so you're kind of, I think of myself as like the mother. Yeah. And you sort of go through the pregnancy with the creators, and you put this group together, you give birth to it, and you send it out into the world, and then I don't see it until dailies or the final cut. So for me, it was the entirety. I mean, really, to just see what these actors did, who I believed in so much, but took it to a whole other level. And I would say especially the scenes with Matilda and Himesh and Naban. I mean, those scenes in the apartment just killed me. But also episode 9. I mean,
the entire ensemble is pretty remarkable for just across the board. It's like we could field a baseball team of unbelievable actors.
Yeah.
And
but
shout out to Robin Cook and
Cook in Canada,
and Jen and Mickey in Chicago.
But I wanted just to add, Danny Zavato was who plays Tyler. Yeah. In terms of like leveling up or stepping, I think he found like a new gear while we were there in production, and found he's incredible in the show, and I think he was perfect. And it was very, very difficult to find the right person for that.
That was a long process.
That's another Jeanie finds that turned out to be exactly right.
Thank you.
I mean, can I talk about A Tribe Called Quest a little bit more?
Yeah.
I mean, that to me, is Patrick's idea, but just the way. So I have a friend, his father is from India, and he's half white, and he's a record collector and a lover of jazz and hip hop, like a lot of us. And he was just blown away by the Art Blakey song earlier in that episode. Then that song was the song that was sampled into the Tribe Called Quest song, and then we changed the lyrics just slightly from Black Man to Brown Man. And I mean, my friend was just, I mean, he felt like that moment was for him. And I was just, that was a moment. I mean, there's so many moments, and I love the Parliament with the tuba, and I love that. But also just the Tribe Called Quest, just the way they start moving and dancing, and like we've all done that, and we all love hip hop, and to me that was just such a celebration of,
I had two experiences where it was the Tribe episode and the Bill Callahan episode where I would randomly look at my phone and be like 8 texts, and it would be like, Tribe, Callahan! It would just be like from all these different people. Ruth, what were you particularly proud of?
Well, I was starting with Hamlet.
Sizzlebird, come on.
Oh, well, Sizzlebird was very important.
Obscure.
but That's too obscure. That's in my own head. But episode 10, when we finally got Hamlet together, and it was all, as you can imagine, very, very difficult, and even seeing if we could get the wagons in the building, if they'd fit in the elevators, everything was to an inch, and everything at that point was very, very last minute, and you still have these big ideas, and just, it was the apotheosis of like everything all of us had been working on, like my summer work with Helen, and what are these costumes, and the costumes were totally going to affect what the symphony looked like, because they had to be hand in hand, and one couldn't outdo the other. They had to be completely seamless together. And then working with Steve had a really huge challenge on how to light that scene, and so that was a wonderful collaboration of how we were going to, and that conversation went on for like 4 months before we actually shot it. And just seeing Steve kind of take over year 20 after having worked with Christian on year 0, and then the music came in, and the actors were playing the instruments, and so you were just like living at that moment. And I really absolutely fell apart crying and had to leave, because we still had like another 2 weeks or so to work, but that was the key moment of everything you've been doing for a year or so, maybe 2 years, and every other department was doing the best work and kind of finishing this idea that we were kind of exploring and finally nailed.
Yeah, I was really inspired by Ruth's design for the vehicles that folded out with stages, and from when I first saw that, I couldn't wait for that moment, and that night was really kind of the fruition of all those ideas, and seeing them was amazing. And also the costumes were always so amazing, and every day actors would show up with costumes that I hadn't seen, and they were just so beautiful and amazing, and it was always so inspiring. And in the case of that scene there, part of what we had to take into consideration was the size of some of the costumes and the lighting, so that we didn't catch the actors on fire. So
Yeah,
we talked a lot about that.
That was so nerve-wracking, because I remember in an earlier meeting, Patrick was like, yeah, we need fire. And I was like, wait, no. Please, God, no. And eventually they were like, just make it's gonna be okay. So a lot of the costumes were sprayed with this like fire.
We did tests to see what
to
looked
see
good
what
on costumes without ruining the texture.
Because traditionally, like if you're doing a stunt, all costumes have to be natural fibers in order for it to be near fire. And I was very set on everything as synthetic as possible, because that's what would be left in this world. And so the fire, it was just so nerve-wracking. And then, when the ghost, Hamlet's father, like lit that torch, I was like, please, God. His whole entire head's made out of cardboard. Like, please. Please. Like, they were like, oh, and I was like, please don't be set on fire.
David, what about you?
We did actually dial back some of the pot lights, like the fire on the stage. We minimized them to give room for the actors to move with their costumes on.
That's amazing. David, what about you? What's a moment you were particularly proud of?
I guess the last scene of the show.
Yeah.
I won't explain it. I won't spoil it, but it's just very simple. Like, it's in terms of the editing about it, it's just 2 people, and I remember reading it, and it's almost exactly what was in the script. The actors just crushed it. It was an amazing location. I remember reading it and I sent Pat a song. And I was like, this is how we're going to end the show.
That was a year and a half before we shot it.
Wow.
I was like, I will clear that song. I love it. She was on board, and it was just kind of one of those things that felt right at the beginning, and every step of the way got better, and so I was always thinking that one.
And we had scouted the V in the road. We had scouted it a few different places, and that road is actually in a park, and all the roads in that park were named like Station 9, Station 10, and there's actually a Station 11 road that led us to that.
We couldn't not do it at that point. Luckily, it turned out to be the perfect location.
Jeremy was still humming and hawing over another location. I was like, Jeremy, it says Station 11 right here. How can we not shoot it? So we did.
Pat, do you have? I mean, it's hard, I guess, to ask you because it's all of it. But I mean, like, what do you think? Is there a moment that has become like a sneaky favorite moment, or a moment you're super proud of about the show?
In the show?
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of just like the experience of making it,
yeah.
it is sort of, it's all of theirs, and then every moment of making the show somehow it felt like a unique and maybe never recreatable situation, and then the pandemic on top of it just made it more rare and special and almost magic. I don't know, holy. But I would say I had a moment. I had a moment watching Danielle do the monologue in the dark. She did the rehearsal first. We weren't rolling. Do you remember this, Steve? And she was only lit by that cell phone, which Steve did not want to be using to light her face, but I made him. Thank you. But she did the monologue and the exchange, and we had the actor who was the pilot sitting off camera to read with her. Yeah. And we were all just quiet in the dark, and she did it, and he did his line perfectly right at the end, and she says, what did the message say? That I'll be home soon. And he just crushed it, and everyone started crying like on the set. And it was a moment, I think, in the shoot where it was about a month in Canada, and we knew we were in good shape, but Danielle coming back and bringing her energy back and arriving, and then just doing that scene made it feel like it was just gonna work. The whole show was gonna work.
Shout out to Danielle.
Yeah. We have time for a couple questions, if anybody has any. Over there? Yeah.
I have a microphone for you. Here you go. More of a comment than a question. No, I'm kidding. The whole
Nice.
cast is
well done.
Thanks. I think I got to do the classics. Everyone in the cast, everyone on the stage is amazing, but I'm particularly interested in hearing more about the casting of Matilda Lawler. Because first of all, I would assume that, you can tell me if I'm wrong, Mackenzie Davis was cast first. So was it really intimidating to think about someone matching her level, which is very high? And then was it hard to find Matilda, and what was it like to find her?
I mean, when you're trying to find a younger version of Mackenzie, for sure, a challenge, just because she's so extraordinary as an actress. We ultimately didn't read that many people. I had seen Matilda in a play called The Ferryman on Broadway a couple of years before, and she had just sort of blown my mind. She was a huge ensemble piece, and there was a monologue that an actress named Fanula Flanagan did that I think was probably like a 5 or 10 minute monologue. And Matilda and some of the other younger kids were just sitting around her listening to the story. I think I'd seen the play had been running for several months already, and I could not take my eyes off of Matilda, even though it was about Fanula, because she was so engaged in what was probably the 100th time she had heard this monologue. And I just, there was just, again, she was so present. and there just was something about her. So, and you know, weirdly enough, she matched enough. But
well, we didn't think about it like find someone who can match Mackenzie, and I think that was good. I think we just let go of that because it was 20 years away, and we just needed a really good actor.
Yeah, who had, you know, the fierceness, the vulnerability,
and the old soulness.
The old soulness.
It was the moment that really just made it very, very clear was when Himesh and Matilda did a chemistry read together for us, and their dynamic existed already.
Yeah, it was.
That was
there
what we
very,
needed.
very few moments in casting where you just see that magic that happens in the moment. I mean, and she was 10, 11 at the time, and I don't think between you, me, and Hero, and we were all weeping. I mean, just in that moment.
But also laughing. They were
Yeah.
very funny together, and that also was incredibly important.
And
for episode
Himesh
one.
had to like step it up in that room. It was
Yeah,
like you
I
could
think
just
he
see this moment where they started, and like Himesh just like this, like.
It's like, oh shit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Bring it.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, I read the book when it came out. I loved it. I know Emily, I knew her then. I was very happy for her, and then very excited about the idea of an adaptation when the opportunity came. I read it again before the room started, and then I never picked it up again. And I think the other writers, you know, actors, HODs, people would remind me of lines now and then, but I think I knew spirit-wise what felt critical to keep and get in there, and you have to kind of let it go a little bit though too, so you don't get compulsive about solving. You need to solve your problems, I guess, and the book didn't know about them. So you got to get it in your head and then let it go.
Anyone else? Got time for one more? Over there?
I'm going to give you the mic so the recording can hear you.
Thank you. So a bunch of you have talked about how useful the time was to just sort of play around and throw stuff at the wall and kind of, you know, find time to just revel in everything, I think, as before you were getting into that second block of shooting. Do you think there's a way to, in the way shows are made, bring that kind of time or find that kind of time in other productions that aren't going to have the same pandemic shutting things down? You're shaking your head.
It's just money, and that's the problem. And keeping a team together for that amount of time is nearly impossible. So it was uniquely the pandemic that created a situation where we could have a little bit, have the conceptual ideas, have this team stay intact, and then have a whole bunch of time to steep, and then go back at it. I think it's recreatable if you spend outrageously, but I don't know how to convince anyone to do that because I can see a version where it doesn't work at all, and then you're an idiot.
It also happens sometimes you get on a show and everybody, all the keys and everybody, you might not all be jiving. You might find that there's slight differences here and there, but I really felt on the show it moves so easily in terms of how we were all feeling about the aesthetic or, you know, choices of where to shoot, and so we were all, I think, really aligned, which made it easier actually to move quickly, because we were on the road for a lot of the time. We were kind of like a big road show, always going to different locations, and so
like the Traveling Symphony a little bit, kind of.
Yeah. So logistically, it was really challenging, but I think because we were so in sync with each other, it made it easier.
Well, I think you can see on the screen that was the case. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much
guys.
to everybody here.